Sousou no Frieren is currently the #1 ranked anime on my anime list, despite having only just finished airing, which is a trend that started with Attack on Titan's terribly named Season 3 Part 2 and has since continued for every stupidly popular seasonal anime since then. I don't know what it is, but for some reason, this new generation of anime fans is super into overhyping the hell out of each and every new hit show and flooding review sites with 10 out of 10 rankings, which is why shows like Spy X Family, Oshi no Ko, and freaking Kaguya-sama of all things have managed to sustain the #1 spot on my anime list for all of about 2 weeks before quickly dropping off. None of these shows deserve such high rankings, but their sheer popularity seems to carry the day for them anyway. So when I saw that this winter season was dominated by talk of Sousou no Frieren, a fantasy anime following a cute elf girl and a party of heroes as they journey to defeat the Mao, I thought to myself, this has got to be one of the most generic, lazy, creatively bankrupt concepts for a popular anime that I have seen in years, and I just binge watched all 28 episodes. That was amazing. Sousou no Frieren is one of those impossible, once-in-a-decade anime series that not only manages to bring something fresh to an otherwise creatively bankrupt industry, but also manages to achieve mainstream popularity on top of that. And this is made all the more strange to me considering that the show relies on practically zero gimmicks. There's no waifu bait or even fan service in this show. The female leads have decent enough character designs, but they aren't engineered to sell the show with overwhelming sex appeal the way that Zero Two, Rika, Lena, or practically any other female lead from the last 10 years is. So if Frieren lacks the usual moe bait or tactless gimmicks that most popular anime these days tends to sport, then what is it about the show that makes it as memorable and widespread as it currently is? Well, the only conclusion I could possibly come to is that it is Frieren's sheer quality that makes it so popular. Pure and simple. That's not to say that I believe Sousou no Frieren deserves to be placed at the #1 spot on my anime list, especially when Eva is sitting at number 212. Seriously, what is wrong with you people? That being said, of all the seasonal garbage that I've seen dominate the #1 spot on my anime list over the last several years, Sousou no Frieren is by far the most deserving of the hype. It's literally the first anime I've bothered to finish in at least half a decade. Excluding Attack on Titan, of course, which I finished purely due to the rage-induced malice that is built up in me over the course of several long years of reading the manga as it spiraled downhill from one of the greatest action anime of all time into one of the shittiest stories ever put to pen. Seriously, fuck you, Isayama! It isn't perfect, but it's one of those shows that'll remind you that, oh yeah, anime can be good every once in a while. And it's for that reason that Frieren holds a special place in my heart. That and the Yuri bait was exceptional. As the show's subtitle, Beyond Journey's End, implies, Sousou no Frieren opens with our titular hero, the elf mage Frieren, triumphantly returning from a 10-year journey to defeat the Demon King alongside her companions, the dwarf warrior Aizen, the hedonistic priest Hyder, and the famed hero Himmel. In truth, none of these characters are going to be around for very long, which isn't a spoiler because, again, it's literally the whole conceit of the show. You see, rather than following 4 unlikely friends as they learn to work together and rise to become heroes, as most fantasy series involving evil demon kings are usually about, Frieren does this weird thing where it tells you that the demon king's already dead, shows our main characters parting ways, and then straight up kills off the main hero with old age in the first 15 minutes. And the immortal Frieren, who once thought of human lives as being short and insignificant, is suddenly forced to contend with grief over the death of a loved one, an emotion she's clearly never had to grapple with before. This is our inciting incident, not an end-of-the-world scenario or an insurmountable evil, but rather seeing our main heroine attempt to cope emotionally with the loss of a loved one. And that's basically the entire driving force of the series. The entire journey we take, no matter what crazy hijinks or side characters we may encounter, all roots back to Frieren's desire to put her regrets to rest and properly bid farewell to a man she loved, who she was too blindsided by her own immortality to appreciate in the few precious moments she had with him. What this means is that the majority of the character development for our main cast of heroes comes in only the first 15 minutes of the first episode, and then through constant flashbacks. In general, trying to make your audience care about characters who are already long and dead by constantly interrupting the flow of your story with flashbacks that are only tangentially related to the current issue at hand sounds like a recipe for disaster. And yet, Himmel consistently ranks at the #1 spot for Frieren's character popularity polls, and having just watched the show myself, yes, Himmel is also my favorite character, despite the fact that he's dead throughout the entire show. In fact, Aizen and Hyder are also fantastic additions to the cast. One of Sousou no Frieren's greatest strengths is its ability to use the limited time it has so efficiently. Which might sound like a joke, considering that the first season aired with a whopping 28 episodes, but when you consider that Frieren constantly divides itself between two co-equal casts of characters, the hero's party of 80 years ago and Frieren's current party, and when you consider the fact that most of Frieren's episodes are comprised of 2 or 3 self-contained episodic tales that take up only about 8 to 12 minutes of runtime each, you'll realize that Sousou no Frieren is constantly forced to say a lot in very short amounts of time. The show has to get you to like the main cast of heroes in only about 6.5 minutes. Otherwise, the reunion and shared mourning over Himmel's death wouldn't have any impact on the viewer. That's where Yamada Kanehito's expertise at writing engaging dialogue comes to the rescue. The dynamic between these 4 heroes is immediately likable. I was surprised by how quickly and effectively you get to know each of these characters and their individual relationship dynamics with one another simply by listening to them reminisce about their adventures together, but it really works. And when Himmel dies and Frieren, for the first time in her life, finally begins to understand how much he meant to her and cries, you really connect with her. And from this point onward, every flashback we get with the party will be an absolute treat because of how much we've already come to like these characters. Himmel, though at first appearing to be your generic goody two-shoes hero type, is actually a joyous, rambunctious young man who just so happens to be good with the sword. He isn't driven by some higher power or a strange sense of self-righteousness the way that most anime MCs are, but rather his simple desire to be remembered, which he believes can be best achieved by making a difference in people's lives. But he doesn't let his ambitions consume him either. He savors every moment of the party's journey, and throughout the series, you'll come to understand why he was so beloved by his friends and the world at large. Hyder comes off as the responsible adult type, seeing as how he's the tallest and most mature looking of the group, and a priest on top of that. But his constant drinking habits and general lighthearted attitude towards potential death actually marks him as being the most immature amongst the group. But as we see in the first couple episodes, this changes with age. He matures, and Himmel's death in particular forces him to confront his own character flaws. He adopts a war orphan, gives up drinking, and for the first time in his life begins to fear death, because now he finally has something to lose. Aizen, the dwarf warrior, isn't driven by a sense of courage, but fear. Every battle terrifies him. Death terrifies him, but he uses that fear as a motivator to keep on fighting. He knows that if he runs away, it could mean the end for himself, or more importantly, his friends, a fear informed by the death of his own family at a young age. Like Frieren, his lifespan is longer than that of the average human, so there's a bit of a kinship between the two. But where they differ is in the value they place on human relationships, and it's only after Himmel's death that Frieren comes around and begins to understand Aizen's way of thinking in this regard. These are complex, dynamic characters, and more importantly, the interpersonal relationships they all share with one another are engaging and genuinely enjoyable to watch. But then the show goes and kills half of them off in the first 2 episodes, which made me really worried. I started to think that this was just going to end up being one of those shows that starts off with a really cool concept, but then goes in a completely ass-backwards direction halfway through. I thought to myself, damn it, I'm just going to be wishing that we were following the original cast the entire time. Well, turns out I'm a stupid idiot, because Sousou no Frieren continues to introduce new, interesting characters from start to finish. You have the main additions to the cast in the form of Fern, Frieren's human apprentice, and Stark, a young warrior and former apprentice to Aizen who serves as the party's frontliner. And though they may at first appear to follow simple kudere and generic anime MC tropes respectively, the longer you get to know them, the more complex their individual personalities and interpersonal relationships with one another will appear. I fully expected Stark and Fern's relationship with one another to exist purely to serve as shipper bait, and yeah, the show kinda leans into that at times, but for the most part, the relationship that these two share is quite complex and dynamic. They start off being polite to one another, but as the months and years pass, their interactions begin to turn sarcastic, playful, and generally less verbal in nature. The 2 back-to-back birthday episodes really drive this home. Fern is fretting over over getting Stark the perfect birthday present, all while keeping it a secret. But eventually, after a whole day of searching and coming up with nothing, she just says, fuck it, and asks the man to go shopping with her instead. And he's just like, oh yeah, that's cool. Thanks, Fern. There's no melodrama or weirdness over it because these two are no longer strangers. They're close friends. Close friends don't need to follow conventional social standards, like keeping birthday gifts secret. And then he tries doing the same thing for Fern after he forgets to get her something for her birthday, and of course she's pissed because, you know, she's a girl. She's expecting him to be a little more thoughtful than that. But he ends up taking her to get a matching silver bracelet, and she forgives him. And when we later find out that these bracelets mean eternal love, Stark's like, oh man, I'm so sorry, Fern. I didn't know it meant that. Here, let me get you a different gift. And she's like, don't you ever fucking say that again. You can tell that she's starting to actively develop a crush on Stark by this point. But unlike most anime girl crushes, Fern doesn't just start worshipping the motherfucking ground Stark walks on or something stupid like that. I always hated this trope. Real girls don't do this. At best, they'll gush over a guy in private, but they'll still expect him to take a fucking hint every once in a while and finally man up and make a move himself. And lo and behold, the ballroom dance in episode 15, where Stark mans up and asks Fern to dance with him, is the first episode where you can tell, definitively, that she sees this guy as more than just a friend. Most of this is conveyed entirely through her facial expressions. She's clearly unsure of herself at the beginning, but Stark's confidence gets her to feel more comfortable, even cracking a genuine smile. And then they do this little dip and she closes her eyes and you're like, that's a real line from the show, by the way. Point being, the cast of characters in the show, both present and past, are an absolute treat, and I enjoyed every second we spent with them. Now, it might seem strange that I've been talking about nothing but the show's characters so far, but that's actually deliberate, because Frieren is an entirely character-focused series. The plot is practically non-existent, which should be expected. The show is subtitled Beyond Journey's End, after all. The quest to defeat the Demon King is over, and the only semblance of a goal is Frieren's journey to Ariel, the land of the dead, with the express purpose of telling Himmel how she feels about him, and trying to make up for the fact that she failed to value him in the few precious moments he spent on Earth. It's a fool's errand, and maybe that's the point. Maybe Frieren's journey will inevitably end in disappointment. But the show isn't about some grandiose final goal or desire to save the world. It's about watching Frieren develop and change over the course of several years, seeing her grow to appreciate her relationships with mortals such as Fern and Stark, and perhaps, most importantly of all, seeing her come to realize her feelings for Himmel. Frieren herself is an immortal being, and one of the things that this show establishes, brilliantly I must say, is how the passage of time quite literally means nothing to her. There'll be points in her journey where Frieren is presented with an obstacle, and oftentimes, her first instinct is to simply wait it out for weeks, months, or even years, much to the annoyance of the youngsters accompanying her. This is central to the show's themes, which I want to take a moment to detail because while there are several things the show does right, character writing, animation, pacing, the themes are something which are actually quite unique to Frieren in particular, and I think haven't been explored in high fantasy settings since the main man Tolkien himself. Every fantasy story for the last 70 years has been inspired, in one way or another, by Tolkien's original fantasy universe, and Japanese high fantasy is no exception in that regard. Nay, since the vast majority of Japanese fantasy tends to use traditional RPGs as a baseline, and RPGs trace their origins to Dungeons & Dragons, which was directly influenced by Tolkien's writings, it's safe to say that practically every fantasy anime under the sun can trace its lineage, at least tangentially, to Lord of the Rings. The proliferation of elves in anime is a great example of this. They're fucking everywhere. But the thing is, elves and dwarves and all the other trappings of Lord of the Rings are, for the most part, only ever used by these series as window dressing, a way of sprucing up an insecure writer's fantasy world without having to actually put in much legwork. People see elves and they go, oh yeah, that's a fantasy show, alright. But the thing is, elves, dwarves, hobbits, and the race of man all played vital roles in the subtext of Lord of the Rings. They were never meant to be mere window dressing the way they are in, say, Crest of the Stars, Record of Lodoss War, or literally every other fantasy story since then. Elves are beings of superior lifespans, magical abilities, and physical constitutions. There's really no reason why they shouldn't be the dominant species based on that criteria alone. And yet, they're not. Humans are, and that's because man has one strength, one advantage over the elven races, which allows them to become the dominant species instead. the drive to change the world around us. Magic is slowly disappearing from Middle-earth. It is only by the power of the rings that the elves have been able to stop this natural decay and maintain their own eternity. But seeing as how the series ends with the destruction of the One Ring, it is implied that magic will one day entirely fade from the world, and the elves with it. In fact, considering that Lord of the Rings is supposed to take place on Earth a really long time ago, it is all but confirmed, judging by the lack of elves today, that that's exactly what happened. But mortal man remains, because as a mortal race, we're constantly obsessed with the nature of our own mortality. And because we have a sex drive, unlike elves, we're constantly producing children whose well-being we then become even more obsessed with. This naturally leads to the human desire to change the world around us. That's why we invent new technology, create new systems of government, till the earth and erect grand cities. Because we expect to die one day, we are forced to instead seek immortality through another means, affecting the lives of those around us. Tolkien's quintessential fantasy tale, on the surface, is about a band of unlikely heroes, all many different peoples and places, coming together to stop an ancient evil and save the world. But subtextually, it is about the end of the world of magic, of eternity, and the beginning of the age of mortals. Or, put another way, the end of the era of elves, and the beginning of the age of man. Though there is a serene sadness to this, because, let's be honest, magic is awesome, Tolkien actually presents this as an overall positive outcome. Eternity is unnatural. In fact, it was the elves' obsession with maintaining their own eternal lives and magic that led to the creation of the Rings of Power in the first place. Decay is natural, and Lord of the Rings is a story told from the perspective of mortals, mostly, who forced the elves to realize this, and accept the end of their era. Okay, Octo, we get it. You like Lord of the Rings. But what does your hard-on for Tolkien have to do with Frieren? Well, first, they both get me pretty rock hard, but second, because Frieren pretty much explores these exact same themes. In fact, there's a few lines from later episodes of the show that pretty much match one for one with some of the words I just used to explain the themes of Lord of the Rings, to the point where people who've already watched the show must have thought that that was deliberate on my part, but I promise you, it really wasn't. Frieren's themes are just that perfectly in sync with those of Lord of the Rings. What's great about this is that Tolkien laid out his fantasy world with its many different races for an explicit purpose. His subtext about the end of one era and the beginning of another, of the elves finally accepting the inevitability of time's cruel flow and the decay of the universe around them, is baked into Middle-earth's world design. So when I see all these other fantasy series borrowing Tolkien's world building wholesale, but without any of the subtext that goes along with it kinda bothers me, because elves really shouldn't just be cute girls with long ears. They should be, functionally, living gods with all the emotional and psychological baggage that comes with unending life. And lo and behold, that's exactly who Frieren is, an emotionally detached husk of a woman who, for the first time in her life, finally opens herself up to the possibility of forging meaningful relationships with other people. It's exploring the same themes as Lord of the Rings, but from the perspective of the elves. One of the most surprising things about Frieren to me was just how likable the titular character ended up being. Based on her general dead-eyed expression and soft-spoken voice, I thought for sure that she was just gonna end up being a generic, cardboard cutout kudere type. I've been burned by these characters in the past. I'm still traumatized by the sheer wasted potential and broken hopes and dreams I experienced with Mikasa. Seriously, fuck you, Isayama! But Frieren completely blows every kudere out of the goddamn water. First off, Frieren's emotional detachment from the world around her is completely justified. She's an unaging immortal, doomed to live in an ever-changing world of mortals. It makes complete sense for her to be emotionally detached, and for that detachment to present itself through a general soft-spoken tone and an apparent lack of feelings. Yet despite this seemingly unnatural set of character traits, Frieren is actually one of the most realistically written female characters I've seen from any anime period. Her entire drive for loving magic comes from the joy she brought Himmel and the rest of her friends when showing off her many obscure spells. One of the more subversive parts of Frieren's magic system is the fact that the majority of spells in this fantasy universe are incredibly situational. Spells that do laundry, unrust bronze, or create breakdancing golems. This is real. This is actually in the show. I love them. The vast majority of spells are arguably useless, yet all the same, Frieren is shown to consistently enjoy collecting every spell that she can. One of the most effective episodes in that regard is episode 2, which starts with Frieren teaching Frieren magic and watching as she grows into a capable young sorceress. But then it transitions into a seemingly filler plotline wherein Frieren spends half a fucking year looking for a singular flower, which she needs to see in person in order to cast a spell to summon it out of nothing. Obviously, this frustrates Fern, and yeah, at first, I was totally on her side. This is a seemingly ridiculous errand. And the fact that Frieren spends such an inordinate amount of time trying to find this one flower to add to her collection of spells will make you question her sanity a bit. But there's more to Frieren's goal than just a mere obsession with magic. As we learn over the course of the episode, Frieren's favorite spell is one that creates a field of flowers, and she shared a very special moment with Himmel after casting said spell. He promised to take her to see the flowers of his homeland, the very same flower Frieren is now obsessively searching for. But because Frieren did what she always used to do and shrugged off his offer for another day, she never got to see the flowers with him before he died. And when she finally finds this flower and surrounds Himmel's statue with the whole field of them, there's this beautiful, tender moment where she places a floral crown on the statue's head while apologizing for taking so long to make good on their promise. What at first appeared to be a quirky, unhealthy obsession of Frieren's for collecting spells turns out to be so much deeper. It's Frieren trying to make up for her mistakes, trying to make things up to Himmel. Frieren's regret over not appreciating Himmel as he lived is the driving force behind her motivations as a character. Her growing relationship with Fern, Stark, and the several other human characters we meet throughout the series is a completely new behavior for her. Frieren is actively seeking to understand the mortal world and start appreciating the present for what it is because she actively regrets not doing the same with Himmel in the few precious moments when he lived. In other words, Frieren is learning to be human. The last aspect of the show that I want to praise before closing out this video is presentation. One of the first things that stuck out to me about Frieren when the initial trailer came out back in 2023 was the Madhouse logo. If you don't know who these guys are, they're basically one of the most legendary animation studios out there, with classic titles like Trigun, Death Note, Black Lagoon, The Tatami Galaxy, Hellsing Ultimate, skip that one, Death Parade, and even One Punch Man under their belts. They have, at times, taken the cake as my personal favorite animation studio of all time. But sadly, starting in 2015, something weird happened. They began pumping out season after season of Overlord, which is a mildly inoffensive yet horribly animated show that some people watch, I guess, and almost completely stopped production on anything new or noteworthy. Except for A Place Further Than a Universe and the surprisingly good No Game No Life movie, I can't recognize a single goddamn anime that they've produced in the last 9 years. Which was super sad to see, because between Bones fucking off to make 1,000,000 My Hero Academia sequels, and Kyoto Animation's tragic slowdown after the deadly arson attack that killed half of their senior animation veterans, it seemed like the great titans of animation were slowly dying off. So color me surprised when I saw that Madhouse actually made an anime that people were talking about again. When I first saw the trailer though, I was initially worried because the character designs looked so A1 Pictures, for lack of a better term. And with the announcement of an absolutely stacked 28 episode first season, I was worried that perhaps Madhouse was going to cheap out on the project. Well, turns out I was wrong, because Frieren is one of the most beautiful and consistently animated television series that I've seen in years. The character designs are simple, yes, but that's clearly because they're staying true to the original mangaka's art style, not because Madhouse was looking to cheap out on the end product. But what the show lacks in complex character drawing, it more than makes up for in its backgrounds. Digital art has provided animators with such a wide array of great tools to enhance their art and make repeat animation frames that much easier to draw. But one great downside of the digital age has been the proliferation of CG in 2D animated series and films. In fact, CG fucking killed the 2D animation industry in the West wholesale. But even in Japan, where 2D animation still retains some sense of dominance over its 3D counterpart, the cheap and easy nature of adding in CGI animated elements into any given anime has had a profoundly terrible effect on the industry. Yes, there's the obvious bad CG effect you get in anime that would otherwise have been fucking perfect without it, but the far more prevalent issue is these overly glossy, sometimes straight up CG'd backgrounds that look completely disconnected from the characters on screen. Now, sometimes, rarely, A director will dictate that a CG background is necessary for certain dynamic shots that require a multitude of angles. But even under that specific scenario, they're wrong. CG isn't necessary. Studio Trigger proved that much with episode 1 of Kill la Kill. These shots almost look CG in motion because of just how smooth the camera moves. But if you pause and look at the individual elements, you'll see that they're all hand-drawn 2D assets, each with their own layer, which is then stretched and squeezed in order to create the illusion of a dynamically moving camera. It's brilliant stuff, and it looks a billion times better than it would have had Trigger added in a couple terrible looking CG backgrounds instead. It took more time, I'm sure it also took more money, but the end product looks that much better for it. Frieren's animation doesn't ever go quite as hard as Kill la Kill's does, true, but it is far more consistent. All of the backgrounds have this beautiful pastel-like look to them, as if you're watching a moving late Baroque painting. But it's not just the look of the show itself that makes it such a visual spectacle, it's the direction. Most of the show's storytelling is conveyed entirely through visuals. My Japanese isn't the greatest, but even I could manage to watch entire episodes without subtitles. That's because people don't just stand and talk in the show, with mere lip flaps serving as a substitute for proper animation. They emote, they raise their hands, make gestures, shift their attention between different people and places. There are a few shots in the show that are so smooth that I almost question whether or not they rotoscoped it. Seriously, I hope they didn't, but the dance sequence was so smooth that I'm almost worried they did. The one animation flaw in this show that I can confirm, unfortunately, is a Madhouse staple at this point. The CG animated army. It looks fucking terrible. We all know this, and I won't give Frieren a pass for it. But here's the strange thing. This only ever happens once in Frieren's entire runtime. Let me repeat, there is but a singular episode from Frieren where CGI is utilized. That has to be a modern anime record at this point, right? Especially when you take into account the sheer number of episodes that are in this first season. Still, it's a huge disappointment because for the most part, this army of decapitated suits of armor kind of just stands around and doesn't do anything. Their motion is extremely limited. And I know it's a fucking fact that they draw their characters digitally, so why couldn't they just copy and paste several 2D animated sprites, render them differently from one another to add some diversity, then place them in the background? Why did we need to make the army out of CGI assets? I don't get it. But excluding this one relatively minor flaw, Frieren is one of the better looking shows I've seen in years. And the fight scenes, don't even get me started on just how kick-ass this shit is. Frieren is mostly a show about characters, and thus it features a whole heaping load of people talking to one another. Shit, it literally takes 3 episodes before we get our first fight against an actual antagonist. But when we finally do build up to these moments, the payoff is always spectacular. The writing is on point. No one just stands around and monologues without having a good reason to do so. And when that music swells and a character finally casts their killing blow, this is when the show is untouchable. There's so much more I'd like to say about Frieren, but unlike most things I review on my channel, it's so new that I almost feel like it would be a disservice for me to spoil it. I'd love to make future videos detailing all of the show's many intricacies and the subtle directing and writing techniques that make it such a modern marvel. But unfortunately, the last time I made an hour-and-a-half anime video, Sony decided to fuck with me for half a year with copyright strikes, which is probably why none of my subscribers watched it even after I finally got that resolved. In fact, I am almost certain that the upload process for this video will be fraught with hours upon hours of re-edits and re-recordings, all for the sake of appeasing some Japanese businessman who doesn't understand American copyright law. But even if I can't analyze Frieren with the same kind of depth I'd usually like to, I thought I'd at least make this shorter video about it because, I mean, it's the first anime I've bothered to finish in half a decade. It deserves some praise for being original in an industry fraught with derivative garbage. And genuinely, it meant a lot to me. I felt truly alive when watching this show, as if I'd been transported back to my youth, a time when the possibilities for great anime storytelling seemed so endless. Do I believe it deserves the top spot on my anime list? No. Do I think it will stay at the #1 spot? Also no. But then again, if any overhyped anime from the last half decade deserves that spot, it's definitely Sousou no Frieren. Plus, Fullmetal Alchemist itself is an overhyped show that didn't deserve its number 1 spot, so I'd say it really doesn't matter who's on top. It's my anime list. It's literally run by anime fans, the worst kind of people to objectively critique art in this particular medium. Let's not get our panties in a twist about some arbitrary rankings, alright? But seriously, number 212? Are you people out of your minds?